I never thought life or then the weather can get that cold. I think it was something like 40 degrees or less, and I felt my bones cracking. So that's my connection to Milwaukee. It's carved a memory into my bones, and but still, it's good memories.
So, Muhammad, I think in the 80s, in the 90s, especially in the 90s, you worked closely with Yitzhak Rabin, with his government. So if you can tell us a little bit about what you remember personally, your memory, and professionally, what was your role in his government?
Well, before Rabin became prime minister in 1992, the years before that, I was a parliamentary assistant to my uncle, who was a member of the Knesset from the Democratic Arab Party, the first Arab political party. But we knew Rabin from before because when my uncle first got elected in 1984, he was elected as a member of the Labour Party. And later in 1988, he split from the Labour Party and created the first Democratic Arab Party. So we had a working relationship with him since 1984. And actually, my best relationship was with his parliamentary assistant, a guy called David Leffler, who became one of my best friends till today. If I count my best friends on one hand, he's definitely till today one of my best five friends in accompanying me in a lifetime for more than 35, 36 years. So that's where I gained my first Jewish friend, actually through that connection. And it's a connection that, as I said, has lasted over the last 35 years. And through him, I got to learn one, how the government works and how things can be done in Israel. So Arab members of the Knesset used to be part of Labour Party and used to be part of government, but never as members of Arab political parties. They were always seen as Arabs who are the yes men Arabs, people that are part of the Jewish Zionist political parties, but not ones that come with their own independent agenda, representing the needs and interests and perspectives of the Arab community. So shifting positions, splitting from the Labour Party was actually trying to assert the agenda of the Arab citizens in front of the Jewish political parties and not to sort of be dissolved in a larger political party. That experience of creating the Democratic Arab Party in 1988 resulted in enhanced expansion of the political power of Arab citizens, which is now 15 seats. In the first elections we went to in 1988, we got only one seat. Today we're talking about 15 seats. So the capacity building, the political capacity building of the Arab citizens was the idea then. And as I said, now it's up to 15 seats out of the 120 seats in the Knesset. So it started very well. I mean, today when we refer to the period of Rabin, we call it the Golden Ages, borrowing from Jewish history. The Golden Ages refer to the time when Jews lived very well under Islamic rule in Andalusia. So if we refer to the best times of Arab citizens in Israel, we refer to the Rabin period. That's the Golden Ages. And not only because of the policies, but also because of the atmosphere. There was a feeling that Jews and Arabs can govern together, not just can be nice to each other, not just talk about coexistence while keeping hierarchy, not talking about being nice to each other in terms of what we call the social contact theory. Feely, touchy, you call it in America, apple and mother and apple pie, something like that. It's not just a let's get culture sharing type of thing, but let's start creating a new reality. And the new reality that was created, it was done out of mutual interest. It was done out of mutual benefit. Both sides were benefiting from it. And I would say for the first times we started feeling that government doors are opened to Arab citizens. It's not only a Jewish government, it's not only a Jewish state, it's also an Israeli government, and it's also an Israeli state. The state of Israel sort of started maturing from being only Jewish to becoming all Israeli, to be more inclusive in its view of its citizens, that it started reflecting the 100% citizens and not only the 80% citizens of the state. So it's definitely seen as a maturity process. And me being in that historic period when that process was happening and being part of actually crystallizing it, walking a path that has never been walked before, being able to walk in the prime minister's office 3-4 times a week without even asking for permission, feeling that I'm part of the government structure that works very cohesively, and that I felt very natural walking into the prime minister's office and walking into other government ministries and presenting ideas and thoughts and projects, and also making significant decisions. Most of those decisions were relevant to us, to the Arab citizens of Israel, affecting our life. When we'll talk about this later. But in more than one opportunity, we found ourselves also talking about national issues. I remember one of the bills that were brought I believe by Shas, by a religious party. It was a bill trying to define who's a Jew. And suddenly our 2 seats in parliament, us and another political party, our 2 seats were giving the majority to either way. Either we decide that Jews are only Orthodox Jews, or we decide that Jews can be, for example, also modern, pluralistic, conservative, all other types of Jewish groups. So we're not only defining how our society looks, but also how Israeli society relates to its Jewishness. And that was really fascinating historic moments and junctions to be in. But let alone, we were very close to the decision making regarding the Palestinian issue. That's when the peace process, as you introduced, Uriah, at the beginning, that was the big deal of that period. And we felt that we were part of a very big deal. And the most important, and I will end my question here, the most important element is that we also knew people in the West Bank and in Gaza. And we were able to serve as backdoors, as a backdoor for discussions, for topics, for, when things in the formal diplomatic arenas were stuck between Israel and the Palestinians, we were used as the backdoor to go soften issues, soften topics. Often these personal relationships that we had with people in Ramallah and Gaza, as well as being able to bring those issues in real time to government decision makers, definitely made me feel part of history at that
time. Thank you, Mohammad. Before we continue, just 2 comments. One, we will have some time at the end, the last 20 minutes for Q&A. And if you're watching us on Facebook Live or here on Zoom, at any time you can either just text or just write any question that you have, either for me personally or for everyone to see it, and we will address that maybe during the conversation or at the end of the conversation, but we will have time for Q&A. And Muhammad, when I start exploring this series about 25 years later, every time I talk to someone, especially in Israel, the first thing they will tell me, are you sure it's 25 years? It doesn't seem like 25 years ago. And we have a thing like, in Israel, like, it's like here in America, where were you on 9/11? And there was like a thing in Israel, where were you on November 4th, 1995? So I wanted to ask you, like, if you remember personally, if you remember that day, and what do you remember?
Well, actually, it happened that night. I was watching the ceremony, the event, big event at Rabin Square. That's where Rabin was assassinated. My wife and son, we had only 1 kid at the time. Now we have 4. He was then, I believe he was 9 months old. So they were asleep, and I was watching the streamlining live broadcast of the event. And suddenly it happened. Rabin got shot. I screamed. My wife came running. What's going on? Our son is asleep. What's happening? And the initially he didn't die on the spot. He died maybe an hour or 2 hours later at hospital. But those were probably the most tense 2 hours of my life, making phone calls to his assistants, trying to understand from them the real story of what's happening. And actually, I was able to get the news about his passing away about 5-6 minutes before it was announced, not much more than that. I wasn't that close to the loop, it seems. But it was a devastating night. Clearly, I couldn't sleep the whole day. The next day, I went to Jerusalem to the Knesset because I was home in my village in just outside Nazareth. Went to the Knesset to be closer to the information, trying to understand the weight of what has happened. It was definitely shocking to say the least, dramatic, scary, sense of collapse of an icon, a sense of collapse, like folding a page of history, or tearing it out of a book that you were part of writing. Very, very, I took it very much to heart, and definitely cried more than once during that week, including the day of the funeral. And you don't know how many people you want to pay condolences to. It's all of the team. It's like we were all paying condolences to everyone around us. It was probably the darkest night I've ever experienced in my life, because, as I said, it felt like the sky is falling. What we've lived with, that making of history for 3 years before that, between 1992 to 1995, that period of making history, that great time that we felt we are making, we were writing history every day, and suddenly you feel that the book got slammed on your face, and that it closed the period. And it was the collapse and the fall of a hero, who still continues to be a hero for me today.
So I wanted to ask you, and I know it's like there's a different answer now in 2020, but back then, like, how soon did you see, or did you see at all, an impact on the Arab society in Israel? And I'm not talking about Jews and Arabs relations, that we'll talk in a second, but within the Arab community, how soon have you seen the impact of Rabin assassination?
Well, it was immediate. I mean, when we went into that, what we call it, a preventive block agreement, it's like a semi-coalition agreement. It was an agreement of 28 points, and 25 of those points were specific. The ending something called a property tax on lands owned by Arab citizens, and the property tax was almost 1/3 of the value of the land every year. So within 3 years, you could lose your land just by debt to the government. That's one. Second, immediate recognition of 7 Arab towns in the Negev that were considered illegal Bedouin settlements. And they received legislation and recognition, government recognition, at that within the first 2 months of the government, making the life of close to 100,000 people legal, living in their own towns and villages. A few weeks later, there was the elimination of the office of the advisor of the prime minister on Arab affairs, which was a Shabak secret service unit that pretty much controlled our life. It was an agency of the Secret Service that prevented every Arab citizens from getting a job unless you fit their standards. You couldn't become a teacher unless they approved it. You couldn't even get the driver's license unless you got approved. You couldn't get to university unless you got approved. And suddenly that legal structure, that security structure that was a preventive block for Arab citizens for social, economic, and political mobility, suddenly that was felt immediately. It happened within the first weeks and months of that government. And the other components that we started feeling was in budgeting. Suddenly, certain ministries that have never even noticed that Arab citizens existed started realizing that we exist. So if you just look at the period between 1992 to 1995 in budget allocations, for example, in education, the Arab citizens at the time were 18% of the population. We were getting less than 6% of the budget of education. 18% of the student population and only 6% of the budget for education. Within 3 years, the budget went up to almost 13%. That was a revolution. It meant opening schools in places that have dreamt of schools, and mainly opening high schools, which created the revolution that only now we feel what it means. Creating high schools in Arab villages mainly allowed Arab girls to start going to high schools in those Arab towns, and slowly this started reflecting itself at universities. At that time, the percentage of Arab female students in Israel, the percentage of Arab female students was less than 20% of our student population. Today, as a result of access to high school locally in the villages, more and more girls finish high school and they are capable afterwards to go to university because their parents usually would prevent them from going to the big cities to get high schools. Today, we are 67% of our student population is female, 67%, which is, it's a process that many call it the Israelization process today. You know, we became more and more similar to the Israeli Jewish population in many of the norms of education, reflecting it in high school and reflecting it at university. But Uriah, it was immediate. You know, you could feel it. It was like getting injections every single week. My job during that period was to spend Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. That's the days when there is when the Knesset is not in session. To spend those 4 days walking around from one village to the other, preparing a shopping list of what those towns need. One needs a school, one needs a community center, one needs a kindergarten, one needs a sewage system, water pipes, this, that, and come back to Monday morning session in the Knesset and start sitting with the team of Rabin at the time in the government and ask them, how many times do you want the hands raised in the Knesset? And for every time we raise a hand, we get a school. You know, it's a checklist. That's how it worked. And so we go on Wednesday evening with results, with practical, real results that were impacting the community. And the results usually didn't take much to start implementation. It's not like now, between decision and implementation, it could take 5 to 7 years. At the time, it used to be 2-3 months. The decision was given, the agreement was made in the Knesset, and the next week we would go to the ministry, to the relevant ministry, present the plans and get the budgeting and start the contracting. Within 2-3 months, the work was happening on the ground. So the feeling was really a feeling of accomplishment.
So
you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. So I wanted to ask you, so 6 months later, right, there was an election right after Rabin was killed. There was a new, very young at the time, prime minister in Israel. We are now almost 25 years later after that election, and we still have the same prime minister. I mean, it was like he wasn't the prime minister the whole time. So I'm asking you now, and I'll have 2 more questions about it. When we're trying to think about 1995 versus 2020, for some aspects of Israel, it does look the same. Even the political impact of that looks the same. What do you think has changed significantly? And it doesn't, from a positive and a negative side, if you try to look at the last 25 years.
Well, let's divide this into three angles: social, economic, and political. I think that from a social perspective, that period created some kind of a threshold of political engagement and political participation and social legitimacy that the Israeli society started viewing and seeing Arab citizens as legitimate citizens, because there was also the beginning of distinction between those who are citizens of Israel and those who are Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. That the talk was that with the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, we need to negotiate a divorce. That was the peace agreement, where you split the house, you create borders, and it's separation agreement. While with Arab citizens, that period basically was more talking like a marriage agreement. We were talking about Arab citizens are a legitimate, integral part of Israeli society. They are in the Knesset, and we need the government has to take them in. And a number of actions were taken at the time that we still are still going on till today. For example, one of the decisions of the Rabin government was called Yitzhak Rabin, fair representation or adequate representation of Arab citizens in civil service, people that work for the government. At the time, the percentage of Arab citizens working for civil service was only 1.7%. And the government said the policy now is to correct it because this is not fair. This is not adequate. Israeli society, the civil service, has to reflect the makeup, the social makeup of society. So if Arab citizens are 20%, 1.5%, 1.7% cannot be seen as adequate. So they started building this slowly. At the first time, they decided to bring it up to 5%. Today, we're almost at 11%, including even right-wing government that followed up with the same kind of process, increasing the threshold to 10%, and we even surpassed the 10%. The same thing with the police. It used to be 1% at the time, and as a result of that same policy of adequate representation, we moved up and up and up to almost 10% of the police force today who's Arab citizens. If we talk about the makeup of the student body at the universities, at the time we were less than 3% of the student population. Today we are 18% of the student population in Israeli universities. Again, by creating accessibility to high school, beginning to lift some of the obstacles in front of Arab citizens to enter universities, and it created the public mood of the word integration. The term integration was created at that period, and that created the public mood, supportive system for it. The same thing also we saw developing in the economic arenas, where a lot of development went on in Arab towns and villages, starting from paving roads and water systems, all the way to creating more and more municipal local government bodies. So the Arab towns are less scattered individuals living in one place, but an organized government, municipal system that, as I said, most of that took place at that time, and changing the status of many Arab towns from the status of villages to the status of towns. And that means you qualify for a budget for town and not budget for a village. So that includes, for example, a community center. A village doesn't qualify to get a community center. A village doesn't qualify to get a main entrance road budget from central government. All kinds of budgets that are supposed to service a more urban style of living. Specifically, that was done through passing a lot of zoning plans for Arab towns and villages at the time. In the political arena, and I will end with this, in the political arena, I think we've been going up and down. Today, I think we are in a worse situation than we were during that period, 25 years ago. At the time, the integration of Arab citizens in decision-making was seen as legitimate. But 6 months ago, when Benny Gantz was elected, he didn't dare do the same thing that Rabin did. He had the opportunity and the chance to form a government with the Arab political parties, and he refused to do that. One, maybe out of fear that he might get assassinated, as Rabin was killed, because he was seen as someone that went beyond the Jewish majority to go to the Israeli majority. He legitimized, as I said earlier, the Israeli majority, the majority of the members of the parliament, and he was seen as illegitimate. That was the claim of Prime Minister Netanyahu in 1996 against Netanyahu. He said to, Netanyahu against Shimon Peres. He said that if you vote to Shimon Peres, you're actually voting the Arab parties in government. And it's not a Jewish legitimate decision-making structure. That mood is still here. The delegitimization process of Arab political participation in government increased, the delegitimization increased, but parallel to that, the political organization in the Arab community also increased. So during the Rabin period, we had two parties with 5 seats only. Today, we have 4 parties with 15 seats. So the weight of the Arab political parties in representation increased. So they're more vocal, they're more present, but their impact on the government is much, much less. Yet, the government does continue to carry a lot of the social and economic integrative policies that were seeded during that time. Not everything was tossed on the way, mainly because even right-wing governments see the benefit of integration of Arab citizens. They see the benefit of investing in education in Arab towns and villages, and that investment has created a huge pool of medical professionals that it's reflected, for example, today in Israeli hospitals. 23% of the Israeli doctors are Arab, 28% of the nurses, 35% of the pharmacists, 55% of the pharmacists, 35% of the dentists. This is a power, a medical power, that Israel cannot live without. Almost 30% of the medical staff that in the last 6 months were crucial for Israel. So it's part of national security. This medical staff is part of Israel's national security during a pandemic which affects all of Israeli society. They're not only servicing Arab citizens, they're servicing more Jewish citizens who are older citizens in age. The average age of the Jewish population is older than the Arab citizens, and that means they have more medical needs. So we provide almost 40% of the medical needs of the state of Israel, which is twice our proportional rate in society. So that sort of mutual interdependency that evolved over the last 20 years carries a weight today that even right-wing governments cannot play with it. It's a mutual interdependency that serves both communities' needs, and I think that this is beginning to happen also in areas such as the high-tech industry. Only about 5 years ago, we were only 3% of the high-tech industry. We are today 7% of the high-tech industry. Only about 5 years ago, we were 5% of the students of high-tech in universities. Today, we are 22% of the students of engineering and high-tech. We're 30% of the students of the Technion. That's Israel's version of MIT. So it's not fighting only for the jobs of cleaning the streets and collecting the garbage, but the intellectual capacity that was started developing in the Arab community, climbing the ladder, the social economic ladder through education, is showing results that the Israeli economy needs it dramatically, and the government cannot afford, even a right-wing government cannot afford forcing ideology to try to prevent this from happening.
So I want to ask you that this will be my last question. I see already people asking me here questions, so we open it for the audience. Just my last question will be, where 2020 is not a normal year. So when you look at the Israel society, like when you look about Israel, about Jewish and Arab relations right now, And when I hear you for the last half an hour, I hear a lot of optimism, but also some kind of pessimism. So where are you right now when you look at the last, not just 6, 7 months, but like the whole year of 2020? What do you think we should be more worried or should be more like optimistic and happy when we look at Israel where we stand right now?
Well, between optimism and pessimism, I prefer to be on the pragmatism part. It's pragmatism teaches me that it's not black or white. Pragmatism, for example, teaches us that Arab citizens are discriminated against in government policies when it comes to proper attention in providing services, whether it is health services or other municipal services that can improve the life of an Arab citizen. And the most obvious place that the worst place is the personal security and the safety of in the streets, which results mostly from economic rates. Poverty rate in the Arab community is about 49%, when in the Jewish community it's 13%, and which results with almost 50% of the crime in Israel is also happening in the Arab community. Close to 100 Arab citizens get killed every year within the Arab citizens as a result of crime, mainly because of lack of policing, proper policing, what we call domestic policing. The police does not really care when the Arab citizens kill Arab citizens. They see us as the dark backyard that they don't care to allocate resources, human resources of police officers to come and make our streets safer. But I would say that my perspective is that the more success islands that we create, that's how we can create some kind of critical mass. We're not at a critical mass yet. So in the high-tech industry, we're moving in the right direction. In the medical industry, we do have a critical mass. In academia, on the student body level, if you count also Arab citizens that are studying abroad, the percentage of our students per capita in the Arab community is higher than that of the Jewish community. It's, we're developing the Jewish syndrome of the Jewish diaspora syndrome, is that you go for education and that will be your mobility. You can't count on your money and assets and house and land. The asset that will move you forward is what you got in between your ears. And most of the investment of the community is in education, 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 but tailoring it specifically to the Israeli job market, because we know that continuing to study Arabic history and calligraphy and all beautiful, nice art stuff and cultural aspects of Arabic culture, maybe it's good for your identity, but it doesn't give you an economic mobility because economically you need to tailor to the Israeli Jewish job market. You need to compete within the 100% Israeli economy and not with a shadow economy or a parallel Arab economy that is only 21% of society. And so overall, I am optimistic. If I wasn't optimistic, I have 4 children, I will pack them and come and live in the United States tomorrow. But I see that they're making their own way and finding their own way in the system, and whether it is educationally or employment-wise, each one of them is simply doing wonders. And just to mention one, and I will end with this: my 24-year-old daughter has just got accepted to do a PhD in genetics at the Technion on a full scholarship. That's the cutting edge of medical research in Israel. My son is doing his MBA because he works in an Israeli company called Superfarm, which is similar to CVS. Again, he's in the management branch and the management system. His second daughter is studying to become a dentist. You see that we are taking ourselves into our own hands. We're not waiting for handouts. For the poor Arabs, we're working twice as hard as any other Israeli Jewish citizen to be able to overcome the obstacles. So we do take responsibility, which is something that didn't happen before. 2 generations ago, or even 1 generation ago, this wasn't the case. But at the same time, we're beginning to, we find what I would say listening ears in the Israeli Jewish community. I think that the Israeli governmental bureaucracy, the bureaucratic system, is definitely very good Israeli, very good system. We know how to work with non-politicians. If you get to the level of the professionals in the government, 99% of the problems are, they disappear. The problem is when the politicians interfere and try to create some kind of populist decisions in order to gain some points among the right-wing voters. Most of the problems come from the political right in Israel and not from the governmental system in Israel.
So Mohammad, I got already 3 questions. I'll ask them and then you'll decide which order you want to go. So the first one was about the 4 Arab parties, what it's called a Reshima Meshutefet, the joint list. If they have 15 seats, is it really they have any power, or if they always vote together, or they can vote, each party vote on their own? The second question is about, do you think there's a chance still today to continue Rabin's legacy from both sides of the map, Arabs and the Jews in Israel? And the third question, let's leave it to like the last part, because that's always kind of a tricky one, a question about how much the Arab or the Muslim community in Israel care about the elections here in America that coming up in 3 weeks. So those are the 3 questions, and
okay. So first of all, I think that the Arab political parties who are now under one joint list, they're stuck. They're stuck under in a box called opposition. And as opposition with a government that is a wide government with more than 70 seats out of 120, the government doesn't need to strike any deal with them at any given moment. They can pass any decision at any given moment. The government is not on the edge of falling or losing a vote in the Knesset. They have a very large majority in the parliament, and it means that if you're in the opposition, your impact is very, very minimal as a political party. You're basically voicing the anger and frustration of your voters, and that's what they do. They're voicing the anger and frustration of the Arab voters. And but a few of them, more the seasoned politicians who have developed connections with either some of those existing ministers or with government bureaucracy system in the past. So if they have a good past, then they might have good connections that they might be able to maneuver and maybe get some results. But often the government would not want, the political aspect would not want to give them any credit for that. Because the government, the right-wing government, doesn't want the Arab politicians to get credit so that they will lose more seats in the next elections. They want to show that Arab politicians are ineffective in a way, so they will not collaborate with them, no matter what kind of proposal they bring to the table. But yet, if again, in a political game in Israel 6 months ago, for almost 4 weeks, the chance of creating a government based on those 15 Arab seats with Benny Gantz was there. It was a realistic discussion. And actually, a negotiations team was created between the Blue and White Party before it split and the Joint Arab List. And 32 items of an agreement were put on, 32 points of negotiations were put on the table. On 29 of them, they agreed. On 29, they agreed. There are 3 issues that I'm sure could have been resolved. I was able to sit in some of those meetings, mainly as a mediator. But I'm sure that those 3 issues that were not agreed on, if Gantz would have taken the decision to move forward and invite the joint list into his coalition, then even those three issues would have either been taken off the table and not continue to be issues of debate, or could have been agreed on. So am I optimistic that those days can come? Yes, they can come. The Israeli political system is based on two main blocks, and they're pretty much 58, 62. Sometimes it goes up 2, 3 here, goes down there. The two blocks are pretty much balanced. What we're missing a Rabin character. We're missing a Rabin character that is willing to take the leadership, to assume leadership, not to be afraid, and have the courage to Israelize the political system and not continue to Judaize the political system, to go out of ethnic politics in Israel and go to civic politics in Israel, to see Israel as a whole and not just through the lens of the Jewishness of the state of Israel, but through the Israeliness of the state of Israel. And that means that you need to carry not just courage, but also political foresight. And I'm sorry to say that we gambled on Benny Gantz, but he failed the test. That doesn't mean that number two with him, Ben Ashkenazi, is like that. I don't know. But I think that the Arab community will continue to gamble. We have no other game. We will always try to find whoever is the candidate from the center left bloc is always going to be someone that we will seek a relationship with. We will seek partnership with. So your last question was?
About the elections in America?
Indeed, it's very important for the Arab community because we see that one, the agenda of the right wing in Israel and the agenda of the Trump administration seem to be very much alike. And there's a feeling that at least the peace process with the Palestinians is put on some kind of a dusty shelf. And that's not good for the Arab citizens in Israel. The history has taught us that when Israel is at least negotiating with the Palestinians, forget peace, forget agreements, just negotiating, it creates a good spirit in Israel that is reflected in good Jewish-Arab relations inside the state of Israel. Because many Israelis do not distinguish between Arab citizens and and Palestinians or Arabs in the rest of the Arab world. For them, we are an extension of the enemy. And whenever the conflict flares up between Israel and the Palestinians, or even Hezbollah in Lebanon, or Syria, or even non-Arabs, the Muslim countries such as Iran, we're always seen as an immediate suspect. So naturally for us, when a peace agreement or when peace negotiations are happening, it creates a more peaceful atmosphere. It allows us to feel more comfortable even talking about peace with our Jewish friends. Today, to talk about peace, you're seen as if you lost your mind a little bit. At least when you talk about peace with the Palestinians, and we see that peace with the Palestinians is definitely more important, for example, than peace with the Emiratis and the Bahrainis. There's no real conflict. Israel did not pull a single soldier from the borders of the Emirates. So there was no war to talk about there. So it's hard to talk about it in terms of peace. So it feels that the US government, the current administration, and the Israeli current government, they seem to like to play with their tails instead of playing with the real issues, playing with secondary issues and not the real issues. And it's a bit frustrating because it means that we get stuck from handling the big issues that are critical for the state of Israel.
Mohammad, there's another question about what part does the International Red Cross play in assisting, helping with the Arab-Jewish relations? And after that, we'll have time. If someone wants to add one more question, we'll have time before we end our meeting at 4 o'clock. Ken, Mohammad.
I do not. I've never come across the International Red Cross inside Israel. And we have Magen David Adom, that's the main rescue health system in Israel, with a number of local Arab small ambulance services. But the Red Cross, I've never seen them in our arena.
Thank you. Anyone has another questions? We have time for one more question, and if not, I will ask the last one.
I got one right here.
Yes.
What is the effect of the COVID reinfections in comparison to the Orthodox communities? How is your community handling it, and what's your view?
And I want to add just to that. Thank you, Alan. I just want to add that I feel like as an Israeli, when I read like on social media or on news, they always go together. I don't know, it's that always been the case. Like the Haredim, like the Orthodox community and the Arab community, every time it's mentioned, it always mentioned together. And especially when it comes to COVID and coronavirus. So if you can talk about that too.
Sure.
Thank you, Alan.
First of all, I don't want to go into detail about, I already explained about the fact that the Arab citizens are part of the medical system. The Haredi population is not. So we are 1/3 of the warriors against the COVID-19. And that's a unique capacity, higher than our proportion in society. Which, by the way, going back to the previous discussion, this is helping greatly improve the status and image of Arab citizens as co-combatants against the COVID-19, hand in hand with all other Israeli teams that are working against this pandemic. So from that point of view, actually, the COVID-19 created a joint enemy for Jewish and Arab citizens, where both sides can be in the same side of the battlefield against a mutual enemy. The pandemic, it has come through two waves. The first wave actually affected only, the percentage of Arab citizens that got affected by it was close to 5%, only 5% of the patients of the first wave, mainly because that first wave was mostly with people that have come from abroad. Most of them were from the Haredi population. So the spread was within their own immediate communities. The Arab community did catch a little bit, especially those that were traveling and came with on the same airlines. But it was not that much because of going to workplace or public events. Now, in the second wave, I would like to split it into two segments. The second wave actually started spreading because of the social behavior in Israel. Big events. We went into the wedding season in the Arab community. Weddings in the Arab community, similar to traditional communities, they are very big events. We're talking about hundreds of people, and sometimes more thousands of people. And that created a huge problem in the Arab community at the beginning, or I would say 3 weeks within the second wave. Arab citizens were 30% of the new cases every day. Almost much higher than our proportion in society. And there was a sense that lack of care, and also lack of police enforcement. You know, I went back to the lack of policing. It also lack of enforcement of closure of businesses and preventing those events from happening in wedding halls and things like that. So the police was less present to control, and the community felt, okay, the first wave didn't seem to affect us. There was a sense of immunity, similar to the immunity probably that President Trump has got. But there's a false sense of immunity that got developed. So people allowed themselves to behave as if there's no pandemic. And that's why we jumped to 30% of the new cases. But in the last 3 weeks, things have been back to control. We are down to 7% of the new cases. Tremendous accomplishment within 3 weeks. Mostly as a result of the lockdown that is more enforced today, but also very strong campaign of the Ministry of Health, which is putting in the front lines the Arab doctors that have also more legitimacy in the ears of the Arab community. When they talk in Arabic and they explain the cases in Arabic and what happened to the patients and all the dangers and all these things in Arabic language, the message goes down deeper, and it is affecting behavior. I told you about my daughter. When usually when we have an engagement party, my guest list was 600 people for the engagement party of my daughter, which was on the 4th of September. But when we ended up doing it, we shrinked it to 13 guests only, including the couple themselves. So that was and that's the case with most of my friends. It's like very quickly pulling the emergency brake and saying, we don't want to contribute to the complete collapse of our community. Unfortunately, that's not the case in the Haredi community. Just today, there was this big scandal that the Minister of Religious Affairs from the Haredi community attended the wedding last night, a big wedding with hundreds of guests. Minister in the government, someone that's supposed to be a role model, someone that votes and tells people you should not have weddings. And he goes to a wedding with a few hundred people. And there was another one with the minister of another minister that broke the 1,000 meters, 1,000 yards distance. You're not supposed to be there. And she went to another town, and she went to pray in a synagogue. And also, that's a minister that votes on decisions that these are illegal actions, and they take liberty to act illegally, the ministers themselves. Luckily, in this case, we're not ministers, so we're not providing any bad role models. And our presence, the high presence in the medical industry, means that we have more presence in the medical teams that are not only curing people, but also talking about the preventive actions that are needed. So last word, I would say that you asked me again, am I optimistic or pessimistic? I think that in second thought, I am optimistic. I'm optimistic because I see things that can be done. I started a project in 2005, which is a cross-sector teachers program in a segregated educational system between Jews and Arabs. I started with having 6 Arab teachers teach in 6 Jewish schools. And today this project has increased to almost 1,000 Arab teachers teaching in Jewish schools and close to 260 Jewish teachers teaching in Arab schools. Those kids are growing up realizing that the other can be your teacher, can be your friend, can be part of your normal day-to-day society. This was done within 15 years, and now we're impacting close to 25, 30% of the educational system in Israel. I initiated the project in 2008, increasing the percentage of Arab women into the labor market to try to fight poverty, to try to create a second income in an Arab household. We managed to increase the percentage of Arab women in the labor market from 17% in 2008 to 41% today. 41% of Arab women working instead of 17% just 12 years ago. That took almost 20% of the Arab community from below the poverty line to above the poverty line after having a second income. So when I look at what we are able to do, I get optimistic, and I think that there's a lot to do. We're doing a lot, not enough, but with the help of good people like Erica from the task force, and also I must say that we received some grants in the past from the Federation, Jewish Federation of Milwaukee. This kind of assistance allows us to create those kind of changes on the ground, and the bottom-up approach is what I believe will succeed in making Israel a more of a just society.
Thank you so much, Muhammad. I can't even tell you. First of all, I want to thank all of you. This was like more than 35 people on the 3 o'clock afternoon in midweek in Milwaukee. I want to thank each and every one of you for participating. Muhammad, this was so important and inspiring. And was everything I was hoping for this event and for this program. So I want to thank you.
For giving me the opportunity.
What?
I said, thank you for giving me the opportunity to be with you.
No problem. And thank you, Erica and the task force. Thank all of you. I just want to say we have 3 more events coming up on this series, 25 years after Rabin. Next, in 2 weeks, we have Ayala Shaked from Bina talking about secular and religious. Next month, November 10th, we have Tzipi Livni with us. Giveret Livni was almost the Prime Minister of Israel in 2009, and she will talk about her political journey from 1995 until 2020. And the last meeting will be the screening of the movie Incitement, Yamim Noraim, about the story of the actual Rabin assassination in 1995. So we have 3 more events coming. Thank you so much, everyone, and hope to see you soon in our next events. Toda rabba lekulam, להתראות.